Good morning and good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to our Trends Report 2023 webinar. We're excited to share our thinking about sustainability trends that are affecting the private sector in the Asia-Pacific region now and will be impacting companies during the rest of this year and beyond. My name is Aiste Brackley. I'm the Associate Director at the Sustainability Institute by ERM, and I'm also an associate partner at ERM's Corporate Sustainability and Climate Change Practice. I'm based in San Francisco, United States, and I'm joined by my ERM colleagues in the Asia Pacific region and North America today, who I will be introducing shortly. But to introduce the Sustainability Institute first, we were founded inside ERM in October 2020. Our aim is to produce actionable insights for business that would help them operationalize sustainability. So how do we turn ambitious goals and strategies into actions on the ground across various industries and across entire value chains in time to meet the ambitious global goals, such as those laid out in the Paris Agreement? At the Institute, we aim to provide the best guidance on these questions in our thought leadership for companies. Of course, if you would like to know more about the Institute, I invite you to visit our website, sustainability.com. On the website, you will also find the full trends report that we will be focusing on today, and also other publications that we released since our inception. And now if we go back to the slide, to the panel, I'd like to introduce great colleagues that I have with me here today. We are really lucky to have this group. Andrew Engel is my colleague at the Sustainability Institute, and this year he was at the heart of producing the annual Trends Report. And he's based out of our office in Washington, DC in the United States. Welcome, Andy. Also lucky to have with us 4 of our experts based in Asia Pacific, who will provide a perspective informed by their extensive work in the region. So joining us out of Thailand, we have Yulia Dobrolyubova, who is a partner at ERM. Welcome, Yulia. Would you like to say a quick hello?
Hi, Aiste. Hi, everyone. Very nice to see you today, and a warm welcome from Bangkok.
Thank you. We also have with us today John Finisdore, who's a senior manager at Point Advisory, which is an ERM group company. And John is joining us from Australia. Hello, John, and welcome.
Oh, thank you. Good to be here.
We also have with us Rutuja Tendolkar, who's an ERM partner in India. Welcome to the panel, Rutuja.
Thanks, Aiste. Good morning, everyone from Mumbai.
And last but not least, we have with us the ERM country managing partner for Malaysia and Brunei, SK Wong. Welcome, SK.
Hi, good morning, everyone. Greeting from sunny KL.
Great, thank you. So if we go to the next slide, we will spend about 15 minutes on a presentation of the global trends report, and then we will turn to a discussion with our panel, focusing on how these trends are unfolding in Asia Pacific, how businesses are responding to these trends, and that what they can do to be better prepared and to have a greater positive impact through their activities. We will also involve an audience through a poll question, so watch out for that. But before we turn to the presentation, I just wanted to run through a couple of housekeeping rules. So firstly, I would like to encourage your active participation. We would really like to hear your questions, and you can post them in the Q&A function at the bottom of the platform. Also, if you're active on the social media, please share your comments and your insights, tag the Sustainability Institute. We would like to hear from you. This webinar is also being recorded, so we will be sharing this on the ERM APAC YouTube channel. And also the presentation that we're sharing now on the screen will be available to all of those of you who registered and joined today. We have also enabled the English transcript feature, so simply click the live transcript button at the bottom of your screen and select show subtitle. And finally, we will have a short survey at the end of our webinar, just for an opportunity for you to provide some feedback. We would really love to hear from you, what we can improve, what you liked, and what you would like to hear in the future. So with that, I will briefly turn over to my colleague, Andy, for a presentation of the trends. But before I do that, I just wanted to share a little more context about this report of the Sustainability Institute. So we have been producing this report for over 15 years. And of course, what we have noticed is that a lot of the broad themes don't change. So we have climate, ESG, human rights, nature, they're here to stay. What changes, however, is their trajectory, their different aspects, and also how businesses are responding to them. And this is what we are trying to explore in the report. And of course, the report is global in nature. So we do examine global trends with a global lens. And while we try to incorporate regional perspectives, it's not always possible to do that. So this webinar today is really a great opportunity to examine these global trends and themes from a regional perspective and discuss how businesses in Asia Pacific should be responding to them. So with that, I'll turn over to Andy for a brief presentation, and then we'll have a panel discussion. Andy, the floor is yours.
Great. Thanks so much for that introduction, Aiste. As Aiste mentioned before, my name is Andrew Engel and was heavily involved with this year's Trends Report, and I'm based in our Washington, D.C. office. Moving on to the next slide, I first wanted to start with a brief overview of what the 10 trends that we cover in the report are. And so the report is structured around 10 what we call macro trends, and these are shown here on the screen. These macro trends have stayed the same over the last few years. What changes each year within the report are the respective macro trends subtrends. Each of the macro trends in the report has 3 subtrends that really define the key sustainability issues that are shaping the larger macro trend. In the interest of time today, I won't cover all 10 trends and their subtrends. However, there are 5 that stand out that I'd like to speak on. However, before I do, we first wanted to note that we would encourage you to participate in our live poll here in the Zoom platform to better understand our audience's views on which of the 10 macro trends are likely to accelerate the most in the APAC region over the next year. We will come back to the results of this poll during the panel discussion portion of this webinar, so I would encourage you to take some time to answer the question as we go through. And again, we'll come back to these answers and discuss them in more depth when we get to the panel discussion. The first trend of the 5 that I'll cover today is our integrating ESG trend, which is really our overarching ESG/corporate sustainability trend of the report. In 2022, of course, there was numerous business challenges ranging from fragile global supply chains, geopolitical instability, and growing ESG criticism. However, despite these challenges, ESG integration really continued apace across the world. Companies, for example, are increasingly linking compensation to ESG factors. ESG-related disclosure regulations are emerging across many geographies, and ESG-related assets under management are growing at record paces. The subtrends, as I mentioned on the previous slide, are represented by the 3 bullets on this slide and then the slides following this. Again, for the interest of time, I won't cover all 3 of the subtrends for each of the 5 macro trends I cover today, but there are 2 on each slide that I will touch. The first one for integrating ESG that I will touch on is around corporate ESG activity and disclosure, and how these initiatives among companies are likely to become more standardized across geographies and sectors. This growing push for standardization in the ESG disclosure space is really motivated by helping companies improve their ESG disclosures and also making it easy for them and their investors to compare ESG performance across companies, which a really lack of standardization in the past among ESG reporting frameworks and standards has limited. The most notable standardization related development so far has been the formation of the International Sustainability Standards Board, or the ISSB. The ISSB was formed in 2021 out of consolidation of SASB, the Climate Disclosure Standards Board, among a few other reporting standards and frameworks. And it's really kind of the initial standardization push, and we expect the standardization push in the ESG disclosure space to continue going forward. The second subtrend I'll touch on here is around the challenges that scoring discrepancies in the ESG ratings industry currently poses for companies, and how these challenges are likely to amplify calls for ESG ratings regulations. Currently, there's significant differences between many of the ESG ratings available today. Depending on the company that produces them, one company's ESG rating could be vastly different than another rating. Because of these differences, regulators are likely to explore regulating the ESG ratings industry going forward to increase the reliability and trust of ESG ratings. In the past, these discrepancies between ESG ratings has been criticized and has opened up ESG to more criticism than it might otherwise would be. And this is especially in comparison to the high correlation seen among corporate credit ratings. And so these differences when comparing corporate credit ratings to corporate ESG ratings has really called for a push for among regulators to help clear out the trouble that some of these discrepancies cause. Examples of companies countries already pursuing or considering ESG regulation include France and the UK and Europe, while in Asia, India is also considering regulating ESG ratings as well. The second trend I'll touch on today is our responding to climate change trend, which is of course our climate focused trend of the report. In 2022, corporate climate action progress was really a mixed bag. While the number of net zero goals continued to grow, as it has in the last few years, there are also emerging concerns that many companies lack robust implementation plans to actually achieve these goals, especially the more aggressive among them. And so this lack of implementation plan is a really growing concern for companies and their stakeholders in terms of, are these companies able to actually meet their net zero and other climate targets? Meanwhile, physical climate change effects were also felt with increasing intensity throughout the world, really highlighting the need for aggressive action on climate change. For example, there was catastrophic flooding in Pakistan, record heat waves throughout the UK and in Europe, as well as costly droughts in China. The first crisis and how it's likely to likely accelerate the global energy transition. Of course, in 2022, there was considerable global energy upheaval as factors such as geopolitical tensions, slowing economic recoveries, as well as fuel shortages in parts of the globe really complicated the energy situation for many countries and companies. While in the short term, the energy crisis has caused difficulties around the world, in the long term, it's likely to accelerate the global energy transition as both countries and companies look to build out clean energy capacity to protect against external energy shocks in the future. The second trend sub-trend I'll touch on here is around carbon credits, and particularly those sourced from natural climate solutions, which will be increasingly utilized in corporate net zero strategies as companies look to achieve their aggressive net zero and other climate targets. In particular, we expect that companies will use NCS-generated credits or natural climate solution, and abbreviated as NCS, will use these generated credits to counterbalance the remaining emissions on the road to net zero, instead of using carbon credits as alternatives to the hard but needed work of reducing the operational emissions. The use of carbon credits as alternatives to actually reducing operational emissions has in the past opened up carbon credits to considerable criticism. Most recently, there was a notable Guardian investigation into Vera, one of the leading carbon crediting organizations, into the veracity of their credits. And so this criticism has opened up carbon credits to question marks. But again, we expect that if companies use them to counterbalance the remaining emissions in the road to net zero, they're likely to avoid some of those external criticisms that have been levied at the topic in the past. The third trend I'll touch on today is our safeguarding natural systems trend, which is our really all-encompassing nature and biodiversity topic within the report. So in 2022, I think it was really the nature year. So nature came to the forefront of corporate sustainability circles, thanks to developments at COP15 and within the Task Force on Nature-related Financial Disclosures and the Science-Based Targets Initiative for Nature. At COP15 in particular, which is, for those of you who are unfamiliar, is the nature version of the annual COP climate summits that are hosted each year. And so COP15 this year was held jointly between China and Canada in Montreal. And so at COP15 this year in Montreal, hope for progress in stemming the natural world's decline was boosted after delegates agreed to the Kunming-Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework. This framework outlines a global plan for nature action in a similar vein as the Paris Agreement did for climate change back in 2015. Similarly, this framework will also hopefully boost climate action, given the criticality of protecting nature and reducing emissions. The first subtrend that I'll touch on today, and which I briefly mentioned before, is the rise of the Task Force on Nature-Related Financial Disclosures, or the TNFD, and how we expect it to transform nature-related reporting going forward. In 2022, the TNFD released 3 draft versions of its nature-related disclosure framework, which will outline a structure for companies to assess, manage, and disclose on their nature-related risks and opportunities. In September, the TNFD is likely to publish the final version of this framework. And when it does, we expect that the framework will likely have a similar effect on nature reporting as the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures, or the TCFD, did for climate in terms of mainstreaming corporate climate reporting among companies. Furthermore, the TNFD will also provide financial companies or investors with the harmonized nature reporting they need to compare nature-related risks among their investments. The TNFD really benefit both companies and investors going forward, we believe. The second trend I'll touch on in this section is around natural capital accounting and how it's likely to help companies better assess their nature-related impacts and dependencies. While accounting for a company's contribution to climate change has been a fairly simple carbon accounting exercise, accounting for a company's nature impact has always been a more complicated process. Fortunately, the emergence of natural capital accounting practices over the last few years is set to change this help to lessen this complication by making it easier for companies to assess their nature-related impacts and dependencies. A notable example of a natural capital accounting approach is the Aligning Accounting Approaches for Nature project, which is developing a methodology and criteria for companies to measure and evaluate their biodiversity impacts. In addition to action in the corporate world, governments are already considering or have already implemented natural capital accounting programs. Uganda is one notable example with a program already in place, and the United States announced that they were considering establishing a natural capital accounting program for the federal government. The fourth trend I'll touch on here is building sustainable and resilient supply chains. And so, of course, in 2022, there was notable supply chain difficulties and disruptions. And this was a result of the continuing effects of the COVID-19 pandemic, geopolitical developments, as well as economic uncertainties. And so the supply chain issues have really hampered all kinds of industry, ranging from semiconductor manufacturers to retailers. Consumers, meanwhile, have also not escaped unscathed from these supply chain challenges as they face product shortages, as well as higher costs being passed on to them by companies looking to remediate or address some of the challenges that snarled global supply chains have posed to their business. However, despite these challenges, many companies improved their supply chain sustainability management in 2022 as they increasingly recognize its importance to their long-term success. For example, companies are increasingly expanding the number of diverse suppliers within their value chains, and they're also requiring their suppliers to set and meet ESG goals of their own. The first sub-trend I'll touch on in this section is around how companies are likely to increase supply chain resiliency through production site shifts going forward. We've already seen a few examples of this that I'll touch on in a minute, but we expect that companies are likely to continue to shift at least parts of their supply chains to different parts of the globe in order to increase their resiliency to logistical challenges, such as those generated by the war in Ukraine, or rising trade tensions, as well as the continuing effects of the COVID-19 pandemic. One example of companies already switching some of their supply chains comes from the US, particularly US technology companies, including Apple, Microsoft, and Google, who've already begun to shift some of their supply chains out of China over concerns related to COVID, as well as trade. And they're moving these supply chains to places including India and Vietnam. The second sub-trend I'll touch on here is around companies' ESG goals and how they're likely to impact suppliers by passing along or requiring companies to set ESG goals of their own. And so companies are really doing this to bolster their own ESG initiatives and expanding their ESG impact through their value chains, which of course with things like Scope 3 emissions is an immensely important part of achieving their ESG goals. One notable example of companies passing on or requiring their suppliers to set ESG goals of their own comes from General Motors in the United States, which has developed a new environmental, social, and governance partnership pledge that requires suppliers to achieve carbon neutrality for their Scope 1 and Scope 2 emissions, as well as achieve certain human rights, ethics, and sustainable procurement scores from the ESG rater EcoVadis. The last trend I'll touch on today is our respecting fundamental rights trend, which is our human rights focus trend of the report. So in 2022, human rights were really brought to the forefront of corporate circles by major events such as the war in Ukraine, massive protests against the Iranian government, as well as the overturning of Roe v. Wade in the United States. Other developments are also shaping how companies are likely to approach human rights going forward. For example, Japan and the European Union recently enacted human rights due diligence laws, which will require companies to conduct human rights due diligence, as well as protect against human rights violations in their operations and value chains. The first subtrend I'll touch on here is how we expect that more companies are likely to issue social-related bonds going forward. And so in recent years, sustainable bond issuance overall has exploded. This has been driven primarily by green-focused bonds. However, social bonds, or bonds that fund projects that generate positive social outcomes, such as clean water infrastructure and affordable housing, are now poised to compose a larger share of the total green bond or sustainable bond market after social bonds saw record inflows in 2021 and 2022. As social bonds grow in number, initiatives are also forming to help issuers better develop them. One notable example includes the social bond principles, which outline a set of best practices for using social bonds in a way that maximizes social benefits from them. And then the last sub-trend I'll touch on for this slide is around companies and how they're likely to increasingly respond to fundamental rights issues as consumer pressure rises for them to act. And so we've seen in 2022 that corporate stakeholders are increasingly demanding that companies respond to human rights issues. These pressures rose in particular after human rights issues featured prominently at global events, including COP27 in Egypt and the World Cup in Qatar. Going forward, we expect that companies are likely to be more proactive in their approach to human rights because of these pressures, by identifying human rights related developments that could cause issues for them in the future and preparing appropriate response strategies for them. So really we expect them to be proactive in the human rights space. And we also expect them to increase their human rights due diligence practices, both to respond to increasing regulatory demands, such as those coming out of Japan and the European Union, and also just because of the increasing pressure that stakeholders are placing on companies to act on issues of fundamental rights. And so those are the 5 trends I wanted to cover today. I know it was a quick tour through the report, so I'd encourage you to read the full report to explore all 10 macro trends and the respective sub-trends in detail. With that, I will hand it over to Aiste, who will lead our panel discussion today. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Andy. It's a great distillation of the report, of what is a really rich and long report. I encourage you to read more on the Sustainability Institute website. And I would like to ask my colleagues to pull up the results of our poll. Hopefully we had good participation. I can see some questions already coming in the Q&A. So we welcome more of those. I'd like to turn to all our panelists with an opening question, just to get your brief responses to a question on the trends that you think are most likely to accelerate the most in Asia Pacific and are likely to be of highest relevance in the region. And as part of your response, if you could quickly comment on our poll results, that would be great too. So I'll start with SK.
Yeah, I think like for us, what we see, first of all, let me say Asia Pacific is a very diverse region. Yeah, so there are where 60% of the world population resides. So there are many developed countries and many developing countries. So the pace of the ESG journey for different countries, different sectors are very different. I mean, what I pick up, especially let's say in my home country, Malaysia and Brunei, while we are seeing the pace of effort putting into this journey are certainly ramping up. I think there are a lot of interest, especially on the nature climate areas. I mean, these are the new trend emerging. And also we see there's a lot of like effort put into the GHG accounting. I think Scope 1 and 2 are very common among companies. And some of the companies are actually embarking on the Scope 3, which actually touching on the entire supply chain from upstream and downstream. Maybe I stop here and allow my other colleagues to chip in. Thank you.
Thank you, SK. Thank you. I appreciate this reflection. Rutuja, over to you. what strikes you as the most relevant trends for this year in the Asia Pacific?
So the diversity of Asia Pacific that SK Wong talked about obviously is reflecting in the way that people have responded in terms of, the signature trends. And there is a very local flavor in how they manifest and amplify. However, I think one of the things that here in Asia specifically we are anticipating is an intersectionality between integrating ESG, responding to climate change, and building supply chain resilience. And something that cuts across is the need to respect and consider human rights, specifically around inequalities, which is a systemic risk still in the world that we live in. And this intersectionality requires us to assess or to be assessed from different frameworks. And something that we found very useful, of course, is the whole concept of just transition, which I'm sure we're going to talk about as we move ahead.
Absolutely. Social issues are so important. Sometimes they fall off the agenda undeservedly. And the nexus between different issues and the systemic views becoming so important. Yulia, I'll go to you next. What are your thoughts?
Thank you, Aiste. Well, first of all, I should say all 5 key trends highlighted by Andy are already increasingly being picked up by companies across different sectors in this region. So I fully concur that these are the emerging trends. Coming from the climate change background, obviously, I cannot but say that climate change still keeps up being one of the most critical topics for us in Asia and globally, and regardless of the sector, all organizations are feeling impacts of it, be direct physical impacts or impacts related to low carbon economy transition. Next, I would also highlight sustainable and low carbon supply chains, because again, our region is a global producer for a lot of services and goods for the rest of the world. And obviously a lot of companies who are based here are impacted and pressured by their global consumers and customers. And the last but not the least, also that was my quote, I cannot but mention it, of course, ESG integration and ESG finance. Interestingly, in our region, a lot of organizations and companies are being driven not so much by regulations, but more so by the investors and lenders, who are in turn signatories to various international frameworks or are subject to regulations in their respective countries, in the EU, say, or UK, or in North America. So in turn, of course, this cascades down to the investments and finance being provided in Asia. So yes, sustainable finance is a big one.
Absolutely. Climate, supply chains, ESG and sustainable finance, all core issues in the region and globally as well. John, over to you.
No, I think the respondents are right. The climate change is and should be the most important focal point for companies. With the supply chains, the response there was a little higher than I would have anticipated. I think it certainly is a critical issue, but I wonder if some of that isn't us coming off of the COVID shock that we had. I do think that the natural systems are going to be the biggest jump in the next 12 months, or we have 10 months left, I guess, in the year. And that's because there are so many systems that are actually coming together and for the first time working together. We've seen more harmonization in the space than I've seen in the last 20 years. And I think that's really going to propel this away from simply biodiversity experts, but onto the boardroom agendas.
Absolutely. Thank you, John. And we will dive deeper into definitely at least a few of these issues now in our panel discussion. And I would like to turn to Yulia first for a discussion on climate. And of course, climate has been top of the corporate multinational agendas for a while now, and especially the last months have been very rich in climate-related developments. We had the COP27 and the Loss and Damage Fund. We had major initiatives adopted in the US, EU, and also in the Asia Pacific. We also have, the energy sector reckoning with major disruptions and price shocks. I just wanted to ask you, what is the state of corporate climate action and decarbonization in the Asia Pacific region? And from your work and your observations, what trends and developments do you expect to see this year?
Well, Again, I would like to highlight, as Aiste mentioned before, all countries are different in our region, and companies within these markets also are at different stages of climate change action. However, I should mention that all sectors, all companies are under increasing pressure of transparently disclose how they assess and address climate-related risks and greenhouse gas emissions. So that's definitely becoming more and more pressing point for our clients across the region, regardless of the market. However, what we have observed, especially in the last year or two emerging trends. First of all, companies are moving away from just announcement of net zero targets and defining their high-level net zero roadmaps to implementation on the ground. So the next question that most of the companies would be asking is, okay, what's next? How I can make these roadmaps actionable, feasible, implementable on the ground at our operations, given that many companies have diverse operations across different markets as well, and they need to understand how to bridge the gap between what's going on the ground with this overarching strategy that has been set before by the corporate team. And this is where a very important element of climate governance and awareness of staff and management would be coming into picture, which we see the climate leaders in this region are paying more and more attention at, because only then you can really connect the dots and the corporate level actions with operational teams and what's happening in respective countries or at respective operations. And same applies actually for new investment projects, right? How to integrate climate thinking, an analysis of climate related risks of new investment projects, and how to link this to a broader corporate sector strategy. So that was the first trend, right? Implementation on the ground. And the second one, of course, linking it to overall value chain. So one thing, of course, is scope 1 and 2 emissions, what we can address directly at our operations, but most of sectors actually have the majority of their emissions coming from outside of their own operations, either upstream, which means they need to collaborate with their suppliers or service providers, or downstream, which means that we need to collaborate with our customers or completely rethink our business model and our product portfolio to make sure that we shift away from carbon intensive to low carbon products and services and processes. And again, this needs to be done in collaboration with different parties and stakeholders along the value chain. So these are the two probably major trends that we see: operationalization at own sites and across the value chain.
Thank you, Yulia. And actually, there's a question in the chat that relates to just some of the things you talked about, specifically about supply chain from Kenneth Stan. They observed that it appears that the major areas of focus in supply chain sustainability are on scope 3, supplier response and measurement. And have you seen increasing focus on actions directly lowering carbon footprint in the supply chain? Anything to add?
Yes, absolutely. That's definitely the next step for many of our clients across the region, how to engage suppliers. And again, this hardly can be done in one go. It's a process starting from identifying who your key suppliers will be or who you would need to engage in the first go, awareness campaigns, different joint projects, initiatives. And actually, a lot of companies in our region in Asia are in turn being driven by their customers, right? Because they're part of their supply chain. So this is how they start also addressing their greenhouse gas emissions. Another quick thing I would like to mention is that more and more companies who we work with start building up coalitions, because again, suppliers would be similar to many companies in the same sector, for instance, or bordering sectors, and they start building up teams or associations and jointly address their, engage their suppliers and address their greenhouse gas emissions.
Absolutely. And we talk about mitigation a lot, and companies focus on mitigation so much. There's also adaptation, and especially in Asia Pacific, it's resiliency, adaptation are so important. Do you think companies are paying enough attention to this and are doing enough?
Yeah, that's a great question. Actually, historically, under the international climate change negotiations and UNFCCC process, adaptation has always been recognized as the equally critical topic as greenhouse gas mitigation. However, by businesses, it's not being picked up as quickly as mitigation. And there are several reasons to that. First and foremost, because many adaptation measures, unlike greenhouse gas mitigation technologies, are not economically feasible, or they have longer return on investment lifespan as compared to GHG mitigation investments. That naturally stops or hinders private sector investments. Another important aspect is that they're harder to measure, unlike GHG emissions or emission reductions, and there are fewer standards or frameworks that would allow us to do that. And thanks to TCFD actually, and the scenario analysis that appeared a few years ago, that now allows companies to better understand and provides guidance how to actually assess climate-related impacts and effectiveness of adaptation measures. My suggestion here would be also to look around for what we call blended finance or development finance. There are more and more funds and financial flows available for private sector as well for adaptation projects. We are in discussion with many financial institutions in this region who provide such types of finance for adaptation projects increasingly. And another aspect is to look into cross-cutting projects as well. Some of them can have both mitigation, adaptation benefits. Example could be mangrove restoration to protect the shoreline, but at the same time they can help to remove carbon from the atmosphere. And I'm sure my colleague John can talk more about this kind of things.
Absolutely. And of course, climate and nature are so interrelated. And we have a comment here from Terry Buchanan. Biodiversity and climate change are increasingly interrelated in the natural systems new framework, of course. And we all recognize that, and it's increasingly recognized by companies. So I just wanted to turn to John for a discussion on nature and biodiversity, and to start with a question about the new global biodiversity framework that was launched in Montreal in December last year. Of course, that put the spotlight on nature and what companies and all other stakeholders have to do in order to increase our positive impact. I wanted to ask you, for your perspective in the region, how are companies in Asia Pacific incorporating nature into their sustainability agenda, and what should they take away from this framework?
Well, let's start with the framework. I mean, Andrew did a good job in his introductory remarks of really noting the importance of this and how this framework is very much akin to the Paris Accord of 2015. And I think that the big takeaway that companies need to understand is that biodiversity is now part of the corporate agenda. And if it's not at the boardroom, it's certainly going to be there soon. And while the global biodiversity framework is not a legally binding document, it is something that, one, there were hundreds of companies in Montreal vigorously arguing for a strong standard and a strong statement, and countries do follow the framework very closely. So I think we're seeing a call really for companies to disclose more. We're expecting mandatory. We've already seen 4 countries move towards mandatory disclosures around nature. We're also seeing sort of a general kind of swelling of voluntary work by companies around the world. And a lot of this is pivoting around this idea of returning 30% of ecosystems to nature by 2030. So this 30 by 30 goal, and that's being implemented around the world, including in some countries here in Asia Pacific. So what companies are really starting to do is to pick up, to do 2 things, I think. One is the most important thing is just getting started. A lot of companies are behind really understanding kind of how they relate to the natural environment and how things are changing. So building that capacity, getting buy-in across the company, I think is what companies are spending a lot of time doing right now. And a few are charging ahead with the TNFD that Andrew discussed, which is this framework that's very similar to the TCFD. And I think there's even discussion out there right now about how similar the TCFD and TNFD is, and companies really need to start thinking about this, a couple of years from now, having an integrated TNFD, TCFD analysis. So those are the two things: is getting started and looking at the TNFD for guidance.
Absolutely, and TNFD, just to spell it out, the Task Force on Nature-Related Financial Disclosures recommendations are expected later this year. They will be very similar to the ones, likely will be very similar to the ones we already have on climate. And of course, these will be hugely important for companies, their disclosure, their risk assessment. And John, do you have any further kind of practical guidance for companies, how they can prepare for it in advance so that they are not caught off guard?
Yeah, I'll divide it into two groups because we are in a diverse region. The first group are those companies, if you're a sustainability expert or a biodiversity expert, I think you really need to build the business case for why your company should be making this investment in looking at the TNFD. So taking a look at what some of the policy changes are, both globally and regionally, and then even locally. Taking a look at what the likely impacts and dependencies are. There's some off-the-shelf analysis of the things you can pull off the shelf that give you an idea of where that is. What are some actions you're already taking? Most likely your company is already taking some actions. How can you build on those? And then really taking a look at what's the gap between what you're doing now and the Task Force for Nature-Related Financial Disclosures, or TNFD, and also take a look at what your competitors are doing. So that kind of a quick kind of internal business case is important. Once you've done that, I think the next step is to pick up the TNFD. As Andrew mentioned, it's coming out in a series of iterations. That's mostly going to be finished by the end of March. We're going to see basically the final structure of the TNFD complete at that point. We'll see some tinkering between then and September, but it'll be out there. And the first steps of that process is really understanding where do you impact and where do you depend upon nature, and that you can't start soon enough to start that process.
Absolutely. And of course, we talked that climate change and nature are interrelated. Well, of course, they're also so closely connected to social issues. And Rutuja, you mentioned just how important it is to keep them on our radar, and just to think about the impacts that companies are having and how to increase that positive impact that they have on the communities and worldwide. I have a couple of questions for you, focusing on the S issues of ESG. Of course, human rights have featured prominently, and in the last months and years, probably, there's a lot of issues that have been in the spotlight. So companies do feel pressured by a variety of stakeholders. So what is your response to companies? How can they best balance, on the one hand, this making sure that they're handling all the potential risks, but on the other hand, also making sure that they increase the positive impact on human rights that they have and all fundamental rights?
Thanks, Aiste. That's quite a loaded question. I think around how do you sort of mitigate reputation risks in the age of social media and influencers? Maybe that's like a study on its own. But I think, jokes apart, we are seeing emerging convergence in Asia Pacific on how businesses are respecting human rights. So if I can break that into three categories. Firstly, the large corporations or MNCs that have their activities or supply chains here, especially since the pandemic, or during the lockdown or during COVID, when you were not really allowed to travel and sort of assess what's happening. Since then, the kind of resolution on monitoring, due diligence of human rights and their activities across supply chains in Asia has, we're seeing new case studies, new examples, the use of technology, and a lot of that is playing out in terms of maturity of these organizations and how they've already embedded certain processes internally. Second is with the financial sector. Yulia alluded to sustainable finance and in investing in taking into consideration ESG, and that's where the S in ESG comes in. Which, if you look at the financial sector asset classes, whether it's PE, DFIs, pension funds, they are all trying to embed these minimum social safeguards that consider human rights, inequality, etc., as a part of their investment decision, and also making their portfolio companies or assets what they call as ESG strong, with human rights as a core topic. And finally, for Asian companies which have global aspirations or even other drivers such as seeking finance or getting onto DJSI, etc., they are starting their journey in terms of identifying policies and then integrating that into different aspects of their operations. But the whole concept there is around which are the salient human rights that that particular company or that company has to focus on within its context, and then what can you do in terms of respecting human rights and providing mitigation.
Yes, and of course, human rights and social issues are so connected also to climate change and nature. I think we are, with COP27, the Loss and Damage Fund, I think Just Transition probably got at least some of the attention that it deserves, and hopefully this will continue this year. Can you share your thoughts on what should companies do to ensure that their climate and nature actions actually achieve these principles of just transition?
Sure. Aiste, so you're essentially asking how can companies enable a just transition? Stepping back, I think we need to recognize that there is still some ambiguity on the meaning of just transition, and it is evolving. So in 2015, after the Paris Agreement, ILO released a guidance around a focus on jobs. But since then, the definition of what construes or what are the principles of just transition has had to incorporate aspects like gender, livelihoods, vulnerability, essentially factors that heighten systemic inequality that we have spoken about earlier today. So overall, I think we need to recognize that just transition is more than an outcome, it's a process. So for a fairer and climate resilient future for all, how do you actually undertake that process in collaboration with those that are impacted by the energy transition? And those impacts are, not just on who's impacted by moving away from fossil fuels, but who's also adversely or positively impacted when you're investing in low carbon energy transition, as well as how are you assessing impacts for communities that are adapting to extreme events. We were recently facilitating a webinar in Indonesia, and one of the clients asked us that does just transition sort of impede climate action? And my response to that is it's not an either or scenario. It's about taking people along and leaving no one behind. And in the interest of time, just a few sort of practical aspects on how that can be done. Firstly is to review your company or your business's just transition context, whether it's divesting assets, diversifying supply chains, or transitioning away or using even transition fuels in the interim. And who is that impacting using your conventional social performance safeguards? Second is around embedding just transition principles into your net zero and climate strategies. Yulia spoke about how implementation on the ground is really accelerating. And on the ground, when your boots on the ground, you have to look at communities, your suppliers, lots of stakeholders that are actually facing the impacts of the just transition. So things like inclusiveness, well-being, decent and high value work, etc. And the third is this phrase that one of my colleagues who attended COP27, Vicky Copeman, sort of, really viscerally felt, which is around radical collaboration. So exploring new forms of partnership and collaboration that are stakeholder centric, taking that conventional stakeholder engagement plan and just turning it around its head by living in questions on how are we reducing inequality and how are we as leaders sort of stepping up and helping empower others to take some of these just transition actions.
Thank you, Rutuja. This is really helpful. I'm based in the US and it's encouraging that companies are increasingly also in the US and Europe asking about just transition, what they can do, what are some of the practical tools that they can use to incorporate it in their policies and practices. So there is some movement, but of course we need much more. SK, I'll turn to you for cross-regional perspective, really, just stepping back, looking at the entire region. ESG featured prominently, especially in the US. There's a big debate about the ESG backlash, and actually there's a question in the Q&A whether there's similar trends in Asia Pacific. But I just wanted to ask you a broad question, what is your take? What is the state of corporate ESG efforts in the region? And what are some of the similarities and differences that you are observing between various countries and sub-regions?
Yep. Thanks for the questions, Esther. I think from the many clients that we work with, I think primarily the MNCs and the large public listed company, and also the various stakeholders that we engage with. I mean, we have certainly observed that the corporate ESG efforts have been stepping up. I'd like to actually first touch on the similarities before I talk about the differences. I think from the similarities perspective, what we observe is the ESG and sustainability have become a common topic on the boardroom. And also like we see that initially like all this are be done by the sustainability function, but now it's actually moving very broad based in the organizations. So like a lot of company we work with, they are actually really embedding the ESG and sustainability into basically this is a business. This is primarily the core of their business. And also we observe that many companies actually really embedding the ESG lens in their major business decisions. So this is like, and also when you look at this journey again, because it's such a diverse region, so many sectors, so many companies, what we see is like, I would say there are three pillars. The first pillar is like those who are actually in the early part of the journey, those are getting their house in order. This is looking at like doing like baselining, doing like the gap analysis, your peer benchmark to find where are the space relevant for industry and your sectors. And then like from there, we move on then to the next phase, which are looking at dealing with the risk and opportunity of climate change. When I talk about that, it's like, if for example, you look at factories, if you are focused just on your factory, if you don't look outside, then you actually, for example, like the physical risk, let's say flooding, right? So like you will actually impact your entire supply chain, how you actually source for your raw materials, how you're going to transport your finished product to your customers. So all these are becoming more and more sort of being discussed among our clients. Also, like for example, like the fresh water. A lot of like some of the countries would actually take fresh water for granted, but a lot of the industry, a lot of plants, gradually will find that this will become a scarcity. So there are companies who are actually looking at this already. And now I'd like to also turn a bit to, then the third pillars I'd like to talk a little bit is on the implementing the decarbonization strategy, like what Yulia mentioned just now. We also see companies who are actually gradually moving towards, right, yes, knowing the journey to the net zero, 2050, 2060, and so on. And then like how they actually look at this developing new business opportunity. They're actually creating new business opportunity. And this is some of the similarity we see. That means in summary, this is the effort is certainly stepping up. But also on the flip side, we also see the difference in pace and also resources invested in ESG. I would say like from the client and the stakeholders we work with and engage with, I think the pace setter we set are those companies like tech companies, large banks and financial institutions, and also like diversified energy company, which actually conduct their business across Asia and globally. They are very aware of the pressure from different stakeholders on the ESG lens. But on the other hand, we also see the companies who are on an earlier stage of their ESG journey, especially industry, those are quite negatively impacted by the COVID over the last 3 years. For example, like the hospitality or tourism sectors, and also the SME, the small and medium price enterprise, which form a big part of the supply chain for a lot of the big corporations. I mean, they are more on the earlier part of the journey, but it's important, like what Rutuja mentioned, no companies or no one are left behind. And we need to actually look at this from the holistic basis, because like when you talk about like scope 3, you actually look at the entire supply chain. And these are the discussion that the collaboration among different organizations are becoming very, very critical. Maybe I pause here. Thanks, Esther.
Thank you, SK. And do you have a quick response to the question about the backlash against ESG, especially in the US? There's been a lot of polarization of the issues. Are there any similar trends in Asia Pacific? Are you seeing any kind of chance of ESG being rolled back in any way?
Well, yeah, I think from some of the discussion with friends and colleagues and also our stakeholders, I think we sense there's some undercurrent of that as well. Because again, like mindful that energy prices are increasing. There's a lot of stress on the resources, And then like, but I think this I would see is more like a blip on the long journey. In the long journey, because I think everyone acknowledge the net zero, everyone appreciate the climate change, and this is like trended, not reversing, right? But of course, I mean, like when it comes to the trade-off of resources, how you actually balance out, right? Because also I'm mindful, some companies are still looking at survival. It's like not everyone has all the resources to do a lot of this, but again, you look at the big picture, looking at the long journey, because this is probably some nuances along the journey, but by and large, we see that the ESG and the sustainability pathway forward are not changing.
Yes, and another question I had for you was just about the larger macroeconomic picture. You know, the global economy has experienced a slowdown, and there's still, you know, major risk of a global recession. At the same time, we have China opening up. You know, that's a major boost to the economies in Asia Pacific. How do you think these macro developments and the developments in China are likely to impact corporate sustainability developments in the region?
Yeah, I would say, like, by and large, I'm a very optimistic person. If you look at the broad sense, like despite the slowdown, right, in US and Europe, but also like the opening up of China, I would say overall for Asia Pacific as a whole, it's a net positive for the Asia Pacific economy. I think particularly I would say like Southeast Asia countries, Japan, Korea. I mean, this is with the influx of the Chinese tourists and also the outbound China investment. So I think net I would say is a plus for Asia, and then we look to dive to the other sectors, right? If you go a bit deeper, we see that the financial sector, like Yulia alluded a little bit just now, I think the funding on the renewables, the green project will continue. But also we see, I mean, is the institutional funds and also the private equities, they are imposing higher regulation and standards to the ESG compliance for the portfolio companies. All this will continue to actually ramp up the activities, yeah. And also like not forgetting like the GG accounting. The companies are putting more effort on the GG accountings, and all these efforts will also further encourage the activities in the sustainability space.
Thank you so much. We are coming up to the top of the hour, so almost at the end of our scheduled time. I think we'll try to squeeze in one more question from the audience, and then we have one quick closing question for the entire panel. There's a question here from Andrew Waters about the gap between what is needed versus what is being provided for the emerging. Wondering if anybody on the panel has views or potential thoughts on this, green investments and just the finance flows in the region.
I could take it up. I've also sent a response to Andrew privately. I think essentially what we're seeing within the MDBs, I think his question was focused around MDBs or the multilateral development banks, is that they initially have a set of activities which are green tagged, or they're called climate smart. And that's more from identifying opportunities. But once you identify an opportunity, you still have to validate whether the investment thesis is actually aligned with that objective of being climate smart or sustainable. And that's where your conventional due diligence, ENS risk assessments, etc. come in. And then that sort of sets you up for a longer term compliance and a monitoring process. There's, you know, when you talk about the gap, I think one of the things that we're seeing is that the KPIs that is agreed between the borrower and the MDB on what constitutes, or the KPIs of that SLL or the sustainability linked loan, how are you getting that data? How does that data actually resonate with what's happening on the ground? I think that's again an area which has to sort of, you know, influence MDB's lending decisions.
Thank you, Rutuja. And now, since I have one last closing question, and we literally have just you know, a minute or two left of our webinar. I know we covered a lot of trends, a lot of different topics. I wanted to ask you if there's an emerging trend, an interesting emerging trend that you're seeing in the region that was not included in the report or our conversation, and that is likely to feature prominently this year or next. And Rutuja, would you like to go first?
Sure. Thanks, Aiste. I don't know if it's a trend or not, but I think we're seeing the workforce in Asia Pacific. I know it's global as well, but essentially, when you talk about the great resignation or the great attrition or whatever it is, there's this diversity in terms of millennials and Gen Z that's in the workforce, that's part of the consumer base, and them really driving what companies need to do and how companies action and actually walk the talk is going to be interesting to sort of just track.
Thank you, Rutuja. John, what's yours? What's your emerging trend?
I think there's much more, I guess, awareness and acceptance of the seriousness of the situation that I haven't seen before. I know most of my interaction is here in Australia, and we've seen a huge political shift. So I think that's happening. I'm hearing rumors of that elsewhere in the region. So I think that's portends a stronger push towards these issues.
Thanks, John. SK, what's your perspective?
I think from the, especially from the Malaysia perspective, I would say the voluntary carbon market, they generate a lot of interest, especially into the nature-based solution, nature climate activities. I know. So like this is not only in Malaysia. I see like this also. There's a lot of requests for, or these are activities for us in Southeast Asia. Yeah. Thank you.
Thanks, SK, and then Yulia.
I would say digitalization, a lot of digital solutions and tools that help us better manage ESG data and report it and transparently monitor progress over time.
Thank you, Yulia, SK, John, Rutuja, and Andy. Thank you for the presentation, and thank you to everyone who was involved in preparing this webinar. And most of all, thank you to everybody who dialed in today. We will follow up with the recording of this webinar, and also if we go to the slide, Andy, we have our contact details. If you have further feedback on the report, please reach out, and also please reach out to the experts on the panel that we had today if you have follow-up questions. So thank you so much for your time, and looking forward to our future discussions.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.